We're golden. All right. Well, Ed Collins, I've certainly known him for decades. He's been the natural resource manager for a very long time at McHenry County Conservation District. And now, I don't know, what's your title? Director of Planning and something?
Yeah, it's land preservation and natural resources.
All right. So that means he's in charge of more stuff and doesn't get to go outside as much as he would like. But there, in my opinion, there isn't anyone that I know in our profession in this area that is more inspiring and philosophical about conservation than Ed. And so he's going to talk to us about the next or the fourth conservation movement as he sees it.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate the kind introduction and the opportunity to talk at today's meeting. I don't do a lot of speaking these days, but PREP has always been one of the organizations that I was involved with early on in my career, and I think does wonderful work. So I'm gonna make an attempt at technology here, and I think it's gonna work, and we'll see where we're at. So okay, just do that check. Everybody does. Can you all see the screen and hear me?
Yes.
That's great.
Yes.
I think if you've known me for a while, you know I pretty much when I talk a lot through stories, some that have happened personally and some that have been shared with me over the years, and today will be no exception. So let me begin by sharing something with you. 35 years ago, this very spring, a young man reported for the first day of work at his new job. And it was the dream job, the one he waited for his entire life. Kind of the pinnacle of years of wishing. It was the first job conserving the land. And that young fellow barely slept the night before in anticipation and skipped breakfast just to make sure that he would be on time for that first day. And as you all know, if you've ever been tour of things and a pile of forms to sign, and then the first real assignment in conservation, and that was grading a gravel road that had just been installed a year before to service a new nature center. Well, by noon, the young man had managed to bury the tractor up to the back axle twice in the soft shoulder of the road. The hitch pin had sheared repeatedly, and a job that should have taken an hour remained unfinished. And when his new supervisor showed up at lunchtime, there was really no mistaking the look of disdain at that rutted road shoulder and the equally rutted looking new Ranger. And the afternoon went downhill from bad to worse. And by quitting time, what should have been that long anticipated perfect first day in conservation had disintegrated into a series of mistakes, misfortunes, and misjudgments. So that young fellow decided that maybe a walk might steady his mind before beginning the long drive home to a wife and a new child who were waiting to hear every detail of that first perfect day. So a little ways down the trail, a flat glacial erratic rested on the edge of what was a former hayfield, probably exactly where a team of draft horses had dropped it decades before when the land first felt the iron of the plow. And the young man stopped to rest for a minute before turning around and heading back. And the disastrous events of that day just played in a continuous thought loop. And he wondered if maybe all of his conservation dreams were just that, only dreams. And as those thoughts kind of swirled one upon another, a blue jay swooped down off of a nearby tree and began picking his way along the piles of rocks that marked the once upon a time edge of that old hayfield. The bird stopped every few seconds, cocking his head as if he was listening for something. And finally, he paused in front of a big boulder stack and seemed to listen even harder. And out of that rocky crevice, he pulled an acorn. And obviously very pleased with himself, the bird was in flight almost instantly. And as that jay took flight, that young man felt the rest of the fence line snap into view, almost as if somebody had removed a blindfold from his face and unveiled the world for the first time. And all along that rocky line, there were oaks of various sizes, and they all grew from gaps between the stones. But curious, he walked closer to the trees to discover that in almost every case, they had sprouted from the most inhospitable place possible for a tree to start life. So some random event, a jay that misjudged the depth of a rock crevice, or a spring melt that had filled the crevice with enough water to support that sprouting nut, maybe a peculiar angle of the sun that allowed enough light to unbend the stem upwards till it could stand on its own. They had all conspired to bring oaks to a forgotten fence line in a tiny park somewhere in a rural Illinois county. And it occurred to that young man that maybe everything didn't have to be perfect in the beginning for something truly important to grow. Perhaps that might even be the way that nature intended it to be, for oaks and people to grow in their own time and in their own way. And in that same moment, as those thoughts started to rise like the fog that was coming up to unfurl in the evening air, that jay reappeared, not more than a dozen feet from him, and carefully dropped another acorn into the rocks. And as he did, a breeze came out of the east and it shook the leaves of the small pin oaks along that fence row, as if to say, "Do you understand now?" And that day was the first time that that young man heard the land speak directly to his soul. And it would not be the last. As you probably figured, that was my first day at work 35 years ago. And I've never stopped listening to the land since that long ago spring day when an older world first knocked on the door of my spiritual subconscious. The land's taught me that the natural world is full of conversations. Some are idle chit chat that flows from a planet that's been alive for nearly 2 billion years. And others are quite profound. And some entail great wisdom, and others are simply joyous mirth. Mirth born out of the senses and the emotions that all species possess. So in our time together this afternoon, I'd like to share with you some of the insights that the land has imparted to me over these many years. And more importantly, why I feel we're poised on one of the most remarkable transitions to human culture ever to occur. And why that of all the diverse partnerships we form in the course of our work, it is the relationship that binds us to place that is the most important one that we'll ever forge. In a way, it's a story of two worlds, one that we've become and one that we're becoming. That we come together today virtually speaks loudly to the journey we've been on these many months, not by choice, but by necessity. These 400 plus days carry home the truth that time is not so much duration as it is intensity. That in the months of its unpredictable drum beats and the intervals between the strikes, time has chosen to make of us all exiles from a land that we once held as immutable and constant. We are, each of us and all of us forevermore, expatriates from a world before COVID-19. And regardless of what may follow in the months and the years ahead, our minds, our hearts, our souls will now live in a peculiar form of diaspora. The pandemic has roused us from the false dream of isolation, of separateness, of immunity from the destiny of a larger and an inextricably interconnected global society. The events of the last year and a half, they've been callous and indifferent to those self-imposed fantasies of political and cultural boundaries. But they have driven home the porosity and the entanglement of countries, ecosystems, and societies. And this is a lesson that's been long known by migratory birds, weather systems, and great whales, but we've learned it anew. I'll tell you, it's been a time for all of us of immense despair, of pain, of loss, of helplessness, and above all, of continual uncertainty. But we've also been given a gift of potentiality that is priceless beyond measure. And nowhere do those possibilities hold greater promise than in our chosen calling of working with the land. So to understand these two worlds, that which we've lived in and that which is now unfolding before us, it's helpful to take a look at the legacy of where conservation has been and how the punctuation point of a global disaster will shape our efforts as they evolve from this point forward. So I'd like to tell you a story about this idea that we call conservation and why I believe this moment in history may actually be the best of times for those of us who care about a future that's lived in close communion with the natural world. So it's early August, and a morning has arrived that's been anticipated for since May. In what was once a litter-filled city lot, life is growing in a rambunctious green riot. And here among the cucumbers and the beans, the first tomato of the season has turned from green to red. Now the garden will produce bushels of tomatoes over the next few months, but I can guarantee you that none of them will be as delicious as this very first one. And spring brings perfect conditions for a prescribed fire in a bur oak savanna. And to the land manager, it's a cleansing agent that burns away the accumulated tarnish of buckthorn and honeysuckle. And through the smoke, the land manager doing the burn glimpses a very different past hidden beneath that discoloration of exotic species. She sees the ghost of an Illinois that's lost in the midst of time. And she is determined that her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren will see it as well. On a crisp autumn day across the region, Chicagoans have turned out for Oaktober events in parks and neighborhoods and small preserves throughout the 6th County region. Planting a young oak is the ultimate act of hope and belief in the future. And you're never too old to believe in the future. The planters come from all walks of life and all circumstances. But in another time, in another place, they would have been known as the tree whisperers, the other world walkers, the shamans, journeying through the sacred tree from root to crown and across to the other worlds. Today, they are the planters of promises for the future. So on the surface, each of these activities may seem like a very different type of relationship between individuals and the land. But in truth, each of them is joined by the common thread of an American conservation legacy that stretches backwards in time and has arrived in very distinct waves over the decades, each one building on the one that has come before. And it doesn't matter where you fall on the conservation continuum. It doesn't matter where your interest is in conservation. You share the very same history. It begins with the western line of settlement starting to contract in the mid-19th century. And with it, the nation's view of wilderness and of nature in general began to change. The first wave of modern conservation, the transcendentalist movement, appeared just as the last great push westward began. The transcendentalists believed that divinity existed in all things, but especially it existed in nature. For them, the natural world was the great cathedral in which one could find their connection to a higher power. And nature deserved protection simply because it was the handiwork of the Creator. They are the great-great-great-grandparents of modern conservation. And in one sense, they are the original founders of the Fox River Ecosystem Partnership, the Forest Preserve, the Morton Arboretum, and hundreds of other conservation organizations across the country. The 1890 census was the first in history that no longer used the identification of frontier as a place of residence. And Americans came to a very grim realization that moving west over the next hill when land wore out was no longer an option, because over the next hill lay the Pacific Ocean. The closing of the frontier transformed the transcendentalist thought to include some new ideas that defined the word conservation for the very first time. Gifford Pinchot on the left established modern forestry, and Theodore Roosevelt made conservation a priority, creating 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 150 national forests, and establishing the National Wildlife Refuge System. And he never once apologized to anyone for these actions. The third wave, modern environmentalism, was born in the despair of the Great Depression. The devastation of the Dust Bowl forced the country to confront the misuse of land and the realization of poor stewardship of natural resources would inevitably bring catastrophic social and economic catastrophe in its wake. From the formation of the Civilian Conservation Corps to the birth of the duck stamp to the Endangered Species Act, environmentalism is built on the foundation laid down by these earlier ideas of conservation. Now, there are those of you out there like me who stand at the omega of their career, not at the beginning. And we are caretakers of a torch that we must soon pass onward as others once passed on to us. We actually bear witness to that moment of the changing of the guard in conservation. In a sense, we are the last of the environmentalists, the last of that generation to fight under the banner of the third wave. And that gives us a responsibility. We serve as the institutional memory of our organizations, and we must encapsulate the history of those organizations and those accomplishments into a form that transcends both our tenures and our lives. It falls to us for a time to transmit the myths and the legends of conservation that have arisen from those pieces of the good earth that we hold most sacred, and in many cases have battled personally to preserve. I would say to you, remember that always that to be indispensable to the future, legends need not be wholly true in their details, but they must be deeply true at their core, because they are the lights that will guide our way in times of darkness and with new generations of conservationists. The end of the environmental era brought the first glimpse of our planet from the surface of the moon, and it solidified the fundamental truth that all of humanity shares one world, and that world's ecosystems and its human cultures are inextricably intertwined with one another. I believe it is in this moment that conservation's fourth wave was born. And that brings us to today. We have come to a rare and a defining moment of grace in the first decades of this new century, and we are enmeshed in that fourth wave of conservation. I believe in time it may come to be called the time of the great remembering. For as a global culture, we are awakening from where we have been in the long forgetting. And we're learning again that we're part of the land and not apart from the natural world, and that we are really one humanity. The fourth wave is already underway, and it is unstoppable. Like those before it, the fourth wave welds together the lessons that a century and a half of conservation has taught us, but it is driven by new technologies. It is powered by unlikely new alliances. It is rooted in transformative spiritual revelations about the evolution of life and self-reflective awareness on our home world of Earth. And it is driven by a growing understanding of the nature of justice and equality, not only for one another, but for all of life. The Great Remembering is propelled forward by two tidal forces. One from the outside that is powered by breakthroughs in science and technology. The other from the inside, driven by the transformation of our culture that is now underway all around us, and from deep and fundamental shifts in consciousness that are arising from within each of us. Technology is already changing how conservation is delivered, and there is no aspect of our work that is immune from those effects. From how we study landscapes, to how we deliver our educational messages, a radical metamorphosis is underway. There are many, many changes in technology that affect conservation, and I can't possibly cover all of them, nor do I know all of them. But several of these emergent technologies are already reshaping how we understand and manage natural resources, and they will do so even further in the years ahead. And these include GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, genetic engineering, and robotics. So let's look briefly at each of these. In 2003, using what was then new GIS programming, the McHenry County Conservation District decided to answer a long, nagging question. What's the state of remaining oak ecosystems in the county? Digitizing the information to answer that question was labor intensive and it was untried. The resources available had never been used in the manner that the district was attempting to use them. So initially, the 1837 public land survey notes needed to be correlated with the USDA soil layers to create an accurate picture of where oaks had been distributed prior to settlement. That in turn required overlaying digitized 1872 maps from the McHenry County Atlas to identify where the late 19th century timber boundaries were located. And those layers required vetting with the 1939 and the 2005 aerial photography for the entire county. Almost 2 years of labor went into that project. But the results were stunning in their implication. Only 13% of the county's original oak woodlands remained. Not only had the overall loss of oak ecosystems been astonishing, but also what remained was highly fragmented. Of the 3,000 oak groves that were mapped, only 157 were 25 acres in size or larger. Only 8 topped 100 acres in size. One county's efforts using new technology led to the mapping of an additional 18 Northern Illinois counties and several in Wisconsin by multiple partners with similar results. The findings became the impetus for development of an oak ecosystem recovery plan for the entire region. But had that technology not been available, and had it not been used in creative ways, we may still not know today the extent of oak loss in the region. This kind of technological use is only going to grow as we move forward in the fourth wave of conservation. As a young boy, I remember reading accounts of passenger pigeon flocks darkening the sky for hours on end and sending hens to roost, thinking that the evening had come. And in my mind, I imagined over and over what witnessing that phenomena must have been like. And I mourned and I grieved the fact that another generation's avarice had robbed me of the experience forever. But de-extinction, the use of genetic engineering to revive extinct species, holds the promise that although I may not live to see the flocks fill the sky again, my granddaughter may. And developing de-extinction science for the passenger pigeon has helped define the scientific path for the genetic rescue of many other species. And that path consists of multiple stages from research to restoration. And they include comparing the genomes of passenger pigeons and band-tailed pigeons, who are their closest living relatives and fairly common, editing the genetics of living band-tailed pigeon embryos with passenger pigeon DNA, breeding a new generation of passenger pigeons in captivity, and someday reintroducing those pigeons to the wild through proper conditioning and monitoring. It is the stuff of epic myth. Conservation has used biocontrols for decades to combat invasive species with mixed results. The process always carries within it an inherent risk that the biological control agent, which is usually a disease or an insect, may begin feeding on a non-target species once it's eliminated the target invasive. But imagine, if you will, that the same genetic studies being used to map the genome of the passenger pigeon and the heath hen might someday be expanded to develop safe, targeted genetic controls for common reed grass or buckthorn. Such a breakthrough would be a game changer for natural areas management. And finally, in the realm of technology, the rapidly growing area of robotics is already merging with video technology and species recognition software to allow drones to control hard to treat populations of exotic species and to track animal species without the old-fashioned handheld radio telemetry equipment. The radio-collared animal pings a satellite every hour for 24 and records 24/7 movement and coverage of what habitats that animal may be in. Just that breakthrough alone allows us to know more about how different animal species utilize the habitats that are part of their life needs in ways we could never do before. The growth of technology is accompanied by a shifting in perspective across many components of our culture, and that is underway now. These include food production and economics, climate sustainability, and gender empowerment. During a pandemic, I stopped at a farm stand to buy some tomatoes. And in front of me was a young woman purchasing some vegetables and engaged in a conversation with the owner on canning. She had just completed canning her very first batch of green beans. And I followed her out to the parking lot and I said, here's my phone number if you have any more canning questions. My wife started just like you did years ago, and we can many, many jars every year, and we're happy to help. In the conversation that followed, she talked about discovering in canning a way to control her own food supply, both in quantity and quality. It had started because of COVID-19, but she was determined it wasn't going to end there. She had learned that she possessed power over her life that she had not known before. And in the process, she had also discovered the bounty of good ground and a caring hand. She's not alone. This year, 67% of Americans have indicated they plan to grow some or all of their own food. On a larger scale, conventional agriculture is also being transformed by social changes, by climate concerns, and by evolving concepts of healthy diets, and a new consumerism that wants to know not only where, but how the food that they are consuming was produced and processed. Regenerative agriculture, driven by these changes, have the potential to remake the great grassland biomes of the world, the Midwest, the Continental in South America, the steppes in Europe and Asia, into regenerative agricultural landscapes, not in decades, but in years. The specter of climate change is going to continue to produce drastic shifts in economic systems. We think of that typically of shifts in ecological systems, and that's going to occur, but it's also going to cause changes in how we do economics. It will replace the importance of having petroleum reserves with the importance of having fresh water reserves. And in the process, the changes are going to create a new capitalism, a capitalism grounded in sustainability and resting on a foundation of carbon control systems that include reforestation, grassland restoration, and wetland recreation, all driven by the need to produce new carbon sinks. Closer to home, the next 15 years will see the largest shift of land ownership in American history as the baby boom generation reaches old age. Boomers are the wealthiest generation in American history, and they're about to pass down those riches over the next few decades in what has been called the Great Wealth Transfer, $59 trillion in assets. Farms, vacation lands, and recreational properties will be sold or transferred en masse over the next decade. And it represents an unparalleled opportunity to build interconnected preserved systems across many parts of the United States as land that was formerly unavailable becomes available. The transcendent power of women and the growing role of women as leaders in business, politics, and religions marks a fundamental shift in how human society is organized for the first time in 2,000 years. The presence of a female perspective in important components of the culture will create a more balanced approach to decision-making at all levels of society. From my perspective, as exciting as the technological and sociological changes that I've talked about have been, it's the interchanges that are occurring within those of us involved in conservation and becoming familiar with conservation that really inspire me the most for the future. If the experience of COVID-19 should have taught us anything, it is to understand that the future that lies before us begins within us. I believe these changes are occurring in several key areas, including the definition of sentience, accepting the power of our emotional connection to landscape, embracing the power of story, and the expansion of the definition of what conservation means. Over the past 35 years, I've witnessed a reawakening of the belief in a sentient living landscape among a growing number of conservation supporters. Such a concept, the concept of the genus loci, or the spirit of place, is by no means new, and it dates back to pre-Roman times. But it requests of us that we have a different worldview, that we embrace a perspective of not only justice for all people, but justice for all non-human life as well. And it is wrapped deeply in the fourth wave of conservation. That fourth wave asks us to accept that the preservation of ancient ecological systems is at its root not an engineering question that can be solved with permeable pavers and naturalized detention. It is an ethical question, and a question of what is sacred and how far do the rights of rocks extend. More profoundly, it is a question of accepting that land is a self-aware, sentient entity, and that the ground sings when it is healthy, and it weeps when it is injured. To know land's joy is to celebrate in the miracle of falling rain, and to thrill to cranes as they pass overhead, trekking northward in the bright March sunlight. To know land's pain, and to overlook the atrocities inflicted upon it in the name of expediency, is to ignore the very hemorrhaging of life itself. The fourth wave calls on us to embrace that the underlying reason we support the work of conservation goes far beyond science. In fact, we do this work because the entire cosmos is scripture, and the truly wise culture kneels at the feet of all creatures. It is as simple, as straightforward, and as elegant as that. Now, for 40 years, the twin sisters of science and technology have been my constant companions, and I believe sincerely in the processes, methods, and insights that flow from the work of science. Science provided groundbreaking studies on island biogeography that in turn created green infrastructure and the core preserves and corridors concept that compose the bedrock upon which many land protection plans exist in this region, as well as across the country and the world. Science has allowed us to understand that the high quality natural lands we preserve require linkages through lands that are not high quality in order to survive in the ecological long haul. It's taught us that restoring the land is as important as preserving it. So it's fair to say that science comprises the hammer and the nails of our profession and will continue to do so for decades to come. But a great failing resides within science, for by its very nature, science presupposes that if something cannot be measured, it does not exist. In embracing the potential of this incredible tool, we risk forgetting the most powerful element we possess in our choice to live a life spent in the service of wild places. Thus, my call to you is not to abandon science, but rather to embrace the process of cardiphonia, speaking the utterances of the heart. For our heart connects us profoundly to the very fabric of the land itself. And I discovered just how effective the heart's message can be early in my career, and it taught me a lesson that I've never forgotten. 2 decades ago, the Conservation District received notification from an energy company that it planned to expand gas lines within an existing pipeline that they owned in northwest McHenry County. A section of the pipeline crossed a beautiful natural area of unusual wetlands and mature oak groves. The proposed work didn't impact the high-quality fens and sedge meadows, but it cut directly through one of the oak stands. Well, the rational scientific side of my brain reasoned, well, how bad can it be? The real damage occurred years before during the pipeline's initial construction. No mature oaks existed within the expansion. Ensuring that the machinery stayed within the existing pipeline footprint should confine the damage to already disturbed areas. To my horror, the plan that arrived called for the removal of 123 mature trees, many of them 200-year-old white oaks with enormous crowns. Trees that had begun growing before the first tide of settlement breached the passes of the Appalachian Mountains. They grew in what the company identified as a working easement, or in simple terms, a spot to turn the equipment around in. Our agency exhausted every option. We discussed the rarity of the oak savanna community, but this savanna was not an eye in the eyesight. The pollution control plan included silt fence, erosion blanket, and every BMP that we pointed out as necessary. We tried the size of the trees, only to be asked which replacement value index we preferred. Our bird data was good, but the impacts decades before during construction of the pipeline limited any reasonable use of the forest interior bird rationale. We argued public disturbance, but the site was only open during hunting season, and that approach added a pint of water to a 10-gallon bucket. 5 months of discussion boiled down to one final phone call with the pipeline attorneys on an early fall morning. Now, I'm convinced after many years in this field that there are no coincidences. There are only serendipitous confluxes of people, events, and potentialities. Both attorneys that morning were women, and women possess an innate connection and intuitive receptivity to the creative force of the universe. So we ran the arguments one at a time, and once again, the same counter arguments rose up to negate them. As the minutes passed, the door to saving those trees swung towards full closure, and it was obvious that nothing had changed. The attorneys asked politely if there was anything else. Do any of you know what a Hail Mary pass is? If you're not familiar with the term, it is defined as a very long forward pass in football, made in desperation, with only a small chance of success and time running out on the clock. And if there ever was a Hail Mary pass moment in the life of this oak savanna, it was now. So in that final desperate minute, I threw a Hail Mary pass downfield in the direction of the two attorneys. Yes, there is one final thing. Those trees were growing when young men were marching off to be slaughtered at Gettysburg. And you're going to remove them to make sure someone can more easily turn around a backhoe. There was a very long pause. So long that I remember wondering if the phone connection had been lost. And finally, one of the attorneys said, "What is it you'd like us to do?" Now, I would not pretend that the story had a completely happy ending. We lost 23 trees, but we did not lose over 100. The company also donated funds that purchased an 80-acre oak woodland joining the site. A few days later, I walked alone among the oaks, apologizing to each one that I had been unable to save. And around me, their leaves danced very softly in cadence with a warm September breeze, as if to say, "I will dance with you one last time." I thanked them for the sacrifice they were about to make, And then I used an old Irish folk spell that puts the trees into a deep sleep. In this case, a sleep that would last forever. Science is a powerful tool we must never abandon in conservation. But when we depend upon it as our sole basis for conserving land, we ask it to perform a service it was never designed to do. The chambers of the human heart, the deep empathy and kindness that dwells within all of us, is reached by a different path than science. It resonates to ideas that vibrate at a higher frequency than factual knowledge. Science is at its core data. That which flows from the heart is data with the soul, for the heart sees what is invisible to the mind. Those attorneys on that long ago morning heard all the facts and developed their own set of facts to counter ours. But when our conversation invoked the emotions that drive our calling, you and I, each and every day, the reason that we're involved in conservation, they were forced to confront their own inner moral compass without the luxury of easy factual avoidance. Now, in our profession, we routinely encourage those that are just entering the field to seek out additional training. We counsel them to learn their sedges, become a prescribed fire manager, and to understand how to delineate wetlands. We encourage them to fill their heads, but we must also allow them to fill their hearts as well. There is great power in story, and we are remembering this as a culture. Through the long isolation of the past months, we have relearned the importance of the spoken word, of the ability of language and of our imagination to forge a powerful connection with one another. It is a lesson that conservation is in the process of rediscovering. We do not remember Thoreau because he sought to study the wildlife of Walden Pond. We remember him because he taught us that in wilderness is the preservation of the world. We do not remember Leopold because he studied deer wolf population interrelationships. We remember him because he taught us to think like a mountain. We do not remember Rachel Carson because of her oceanography studies, but because even with terminal cancer, she courageously published Silent Spring. The land that they cared so deeply about, the words they were inspired to speak or to write about that land are surely sacred texts, because their most meaningful words flowed directly into our souls in a language that is beyond human language, an elemental language, a language that rises from the very bones of the earth itself and is old beyond memory. And while new voices and other diverse perspectives on the natural world can, will, and must become part of our literature, there remains great resonance in the words of those who helped to birth and define the early waves of the conservation movement. If I can, let me illustrate the power of even a simple story by sharing with you the tale of how the Hackmatack National Wildlife Refuge came into being. In 2004, sharing a glass that is known to all of us in the conservation business as dream oil with a friend in the Fish and Wildlife Service, I asked, what would it take to bring a national wildlife refuge to McHenry County? He's an honest guy and he pulled no punches. A new refuge needs a biological rationale, but it would also require an incredible and dedicated grassroots organization, and it would take years for the Department of the Interior to even consider. A few months later, a small group of individuals formed the Friends of Hackmatack and set off on a journey that would last 8 years. Literally from the first month, there were bumps in the road. At times, the entire idea seemed so implausible as to border on the ridiculous. But no one quit. No one quit because conservation is one of the most powerful and positive ideas that we possess as a people. And in August of 2012, Senator Dick Durbin, one of conservation's most genuine and consistent friends, and then Secretary of the Interior Salazar, journeyed to Glacial Park to officially authorize Hackmatack as the 561st National Wildlife Refuge. And today, more than 1,000 acres of land have been protected to eventually become part of that refuge. As with all things that are ever accomplished in conservation, Hackmatack passed through the same 3 stages. First, the idea was impossible. Then it was too difficult. And finally, it was done. I believe that what is happening in conservation in the 4th wave is that we are redefining what conservation means. And that redefinition is underway across all aspects and avenues of our profession. My own career came of age with the natural areas movement and restoration ecology as its defining aspects. And much has been accomplished in terms of preserving intact ecosystems and restoring those that have been damaged by human use as a result of those defining aspects. And ecological restoration will continue to be a major goal for conservation as it enters the 4th wave and beyond for many decades to come. But as our culture moves towards a less impactful effect on the planet's web of life, the definition of conservation is destined to grow beyond land preservation and species recovery. It is destined to become a defining social force across the globe. We have begun, as a species, to consider the impact of our decisions on not the next 7 generations, but on the next 70. And as a result of this expanding definition, new coalitions with new battle cries are emerging as the 4th wave expands. Traditional conservation constituencies such as hunters and anglers, birders and hikers have been joined by agriculture and private landowners, green builders, organic farmers, alternative healers, health professionals, social justice advocates, and even a branch of psychologists who work with what has been defined as eco-psychology. It is important to remember that not only a new wave of conservation is being born, but at the same time, an antiquated set of ideas is passing away at the same time. New research in neuroscience tells us that old ideas die hard, as anyone who has tried to be on a diet knows. The brain neurons that control such perspectives are the most active, the most animated in the last moments before they collapse. They fire frantically in what's called an extinction burst, trying to get the brain to re-engage in those old ideas. We have been watching over the past 4 years outdated ideas about our relationship to the land and to each other locked deep in an intense extinction burst. In the end, regardless of the power they may seem to hold at any given moment, these old ideas are simply on the wrong side of history. The world is changing, and our species is growing out of our adolescence. This fundamental maturing of our human culture offers conservation the opportunity to move past a simple voting issue and into a way of life. Now, all of this begs the question on who will drive forward this 4th wave of conservation. Before I answer, let me ask first of everyone listening, if any of the following descriptions identify you. Are you under 50? Are you in a lifelong love affair with nature? Do you speak a 2nd or 3rd language? Are you a woman? Are you part of a group that has not traditionally been under the conservation tent? Do you see nature and society differently than most of your peers? Do you feel the land in your bones? And do you dream of a world that is not yet born? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you are the 4th wave. You are who is called upon to embrace the role of architect for the bricks and the mortar of a new conservation for the next half century. Many of you are already the men and the women in the arena, as Roosevelt once wrote about. whose faces are marred with blood and sweat, who dare to dream great things and dare further to bring them into the world. There are those of you who are just beginning your work in this field, and you are the undiscovered country of conservation. You are the intersection of the impossible and the dream of what can be. You are the alchemists of our movement, and you will transmute a culture from the lead of dystopia into the gold of a sustainable world at peace and not at war with nature. Now, I would share with you one final story, one that carries resonance to this very day, this very hour, and this very minute in our lives. The sickness arrived invisibly, a tiny stowaway in one of the great vessels always in movement across a worldwide trading network. This global network brought incredible wealth to a small group, the self-proclaimed nobility of their time. With that wealth came status and a belief that the natural order of things ordained that some were born to have and others to have not. That this disparity was justly designed by Providence as a preordained law of nature. The inequality found support among the fundamentalist religions of the time, one that damned all other interpretations of deity as false and denied any attempts at personal relationships with the Creator as heretical. It appeared first in the crowded cities, places stripped of nature and teeming with humans, spreading quickly and widely before it could even be recognized as an illness. By the time physicians understood the virulence of the ailment, it had become a global pandemic. People perished by the hundreds, then the thousands, then by the tens of thousands. And in less than a year, entire continents were besieged, and neither healer nor priest could stop the carnage. Ridiculous potions were tried. Useless information flowed from the mouth of those in authority, and still the slaughter persisted. By the time the illness finally ran its course, the dead and the sick outnumbered the living in many places. And the economy that had made a handful rich on the backs of their fellow man collapsed in an unrecognizable shambles. The disease brought down rich and poor, powerful and powerless, until at its conclusion, the long-standing class system also lay in ruins. The world had shed its skin and emerged as an unrecognizable new form of culture, leaving only an empty exoskeleton of that former world, gradually moldering into dust. The Black Death remade the world. It destroyed the established class system and called into question the absolute authority of religions and monarchs. In its aftermath rose the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, and eventually the Enlightenment. And in time, the birth of the United States, the first democracy to be established with Enlightenment ideals as its foundation. COVID-19 has remade the world once again. And just as it was 600 years ago, that world will never be the same. We have lived through a time of terrible anxiety, but we have come to a time of immense possibility that has not occurred in centuries. We have experienced in COVID-19 an event that has connected all of humanity with a shared common experience for perhaps the first time since the Younger Dryas epoch nearly caused humanity's extinction 13,000 years ago by triggering a worldwide mini ice age. It has connected us in a way we never dreamed possible before. We can no longer pretend our humanity does not extend to all people, and that our world and its intricate systems of natural communities and biological diversity does in truth belong to us all. How we decide to use that time of possibility is now the choice that lies before us. There is an ancient concept whose roots stretch long into our shared past, and it is shrouded only in impenetrable mist as to its origin and its original meaning. That is the concept of a blood sacrifice. A blood sacrifice, and sacrifice means to make holy, is something of such value that it has the power to change the trajectory of the world. Our blood sacrifice has not only been the death of millions, but also the death of the carefully constructed world of things that we had come to accept as normal. When true change germinates, it begins in the roots and not in the canopy of a society. In forcing us to become more technically savvy, COVID-19 has taught us the value of real-time relationships with friends, family, and neighbors. In short, with community. It has altered our relationship to deity from large, often impersonal indoor congregations to a search for divinity outdoors under God's roof. We have found ourselves in individual conversations between ourselves and the Creator, however each of us sees that Creator. Tens of millions of us have discovered that our front door has another side to it called the outside. And all across the country, Americans are spending more time than ever before on the other side of that door. We have begun to learn how to learn again, that we have an innate capacity to become more than we are. We have rediscovered the joy of music, of art, of writing, of learning new skills, and of listening to others. We have learned how to ask real questions again. From this blood sacrifice, a new conservation has been born, one that sees our connection to nature, to spirit, and to one another as we have never seen before. Together, all of us, the younger siblings of creation, now hold all of creation in our hands. I know that many of you, like me, have endured the long night of the soul, the sleepless time when one sees only the greed and the avarice that daily consume the beauty and the grandeur of the natural world like some insatiable flood. And we have wondered whether all that we have done has been worth it. Long ago, an older world revealed its wisdom precisely at the moment a young man's dreams threatened to slip away. It requested of him in return a simple reciprocity. That world of bur oaks and compass plants, of northward bound geese and spring wildflowers, asked him to give voice to a world without one. It is the same request each of you have answered in the same way as that young man did 3.5 decades ago. The earth is not without her knights and her shield maidens. And today they fill this room. Giving voice to the land is the trade we make for the days we spend in the embrace of the wild. I will close our presentation today with a poem. A look into that future I believe to be at our fingertips, that moment of grace that we are already embracing. It defines how our work shall come to be understood by the greater global culture in the decades to come. It subsumes the fourth wave, dawning across the landscape that we all hold so deeply in our hearts. Each of you here assembled this day define the we few. This story shall the good man teach his sons and his daughters from this day on to the ending of the world, of those who step forward to answer the call to bind up the wounds of a hemorrhaging world. And in such tales, we shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of dreamers. Those who have shed sweat and tears and hope with me shall forever be my brothers and sisters, bound deeper than the ties of kinship. And those now abed, those for whom the gentle earth did not sing an ancient rhyme to, shall think themselves accursed that they were not here, that they did not rise against impossible odds, and hold their humanity cheap while any speak that fought with us for river and prairie, savanna and marsh. Those who sought only the beauty of the wildflowers and the song of the meadowlark as payment for that sacrifice. We few, we so fortunate few. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ed. Your words are always inspiring and never disappointing. Yeah, so I reckon to say, I don't want to spoil the inspiration of that message. And maybe we just leave it at that, unless anyone has inspiring comments to add to that. But we thank you for those thoughts and words, and hopefully they will serve to guide us forward as FREP and all the other groups that we're involved with.
Well, again, thanks for allowing me to speak today. I truly appreciate it.
Excellent job, Ed.
Thanks, Dave.
And it was all recorded.
Thank you very much, Ed. It's wonderful.
Will eventually
Yes,
be available
looks like it.
online on the FREP webpage. So thank you all. Take that as your inspiration. Go forth and have a great week and a great month.
All right. Take care, everyone.